not try and bend the spoon. That's impossible. Instead, only try to realize the truth.
What truth?
There is no spoon.
There is no spoon?
Then you'll see that it is not the spoon that bends, it is only yourself.
So we can take any physical object and we can encode it into a set of pixels, right? Well, if that's true, then the distinction between information and material reality starts to blur. We may be living in a world of information and not a world of physical material objects.
The Matrix is everywhere. It is all around us.
Hello there, friends and new visitors too. Thanks for stopping by. I hope you're doing well, but if times aren't so easy, my best wishes go out to you. Life's not always great. It's actually more shaping up to look like a sadist simulation in some of the latest scientific questions. And I expect that's going to raise eyebrows, especially among those who haven't already heard much about the human perception. Rizwan Virk, and I hope I'm saying that right, a tech entrepreneur and author of the simulation hypothesis states, simply because we perceive the world as real and material doesn't mean that it is so. In fact, the findings of quantum physics may shed some doubt on the fact that our material universe is real. The more that scientists look for the material and material world, the more they find that it doesn't exist.
And so that's why I'm going to talk a little bit about the history of video games and how it ties to this idea that we may in fact be living inside a giant video game. So I got my start with video games a long time ago. Very classic video games, back in the day of the Atari 2600, Space Invaders and Pac-Man. But what really made an impression on my young mind was when the game started to become a little more realistic. We're still looking at an 8-bit video game here called Pole Position. I would always wonder what was beyond the racetrack, right? You see the mountain that looks like Mount Fuji there, and sometimes there would be bleachers with fake people, and you know, as I was playing the Atari, I would wonder, what happens to those characters when I'm not logged in? Is there a real world, within this video game where there's actual conscious entities? And of course, with the Atari, there weren't, but this got more interesting as science fiction developed. And as I got older, I was a big fan of Star Trek, as many of you may have been. And you may remember the holodeck, which was a limited space, but could project any kind of simulated environment, and it would feel real to the players of the game, who were typically crew members of the Enterprise. But the episode that really got me thinking about this took place in the holodeck, and there was a character named Professor Moriarty. And for those of you who have seen this will remember Data, the android, played Sherlock Holmes in the simulation, but this particular character was quite intelligent. He actually figured out that some of the people in the holodeck were simulated and some were real, and they were from a world out there being the rest of the Enterprise. And so, he wanted to leave the holodeck and he wanted to get out of the simulation. And so this kind of, inspired me to think about this topic for many years. And of course, the major reference these days is the Matrix. And so we'll talk a little bit about this in the context of current technology and where we're going and what this might mean. And as Payush mentioned, this topic has gotten popular in the 20 years since the release of the Matrix. Back then it was just considered science fiction, but there were a couple of reasons. One of which is, Elon Musk said a few years ago at the Code Conference that 40 years ago we had 2 squares and a dot. That was the stage of video games, right? We had Pong, which was the first widely available video game made by Atari right down the road here in Sunnyvale. Today we have virtual reality, we have augmented reality, and we have millions of online players on these MMORPGs in 3D worlds. So what will happen, in a few decades? What will happen in 100 years from now? Will we get to the point where the video game is indistinguishable from reality? I would argue we're actually getting there very quickly. So I had my own experience, speaking of Pong, a few years ago, when I was playing a ping pong game using a virtual reality headset. I think it was the Vive in this case. And I started to play this game, and you'll notice that the resolution isn't that great. The opponent is there, but it's not even a photorealistic opponent. But what happened was that the physics engine was so good and the reactions were so dead on that I actually felt like I was really playing table tennis. And I forgot that I was in a virtual reality headset. In fact, At the end of the game, I put the paddle down on the table and I leaned against the table, just like I might do after playing a game of table tennis. Of course, the controller fell to the floor. There was no table, and I almost fell over. And so then I really started to think, okay, it's not so much about the resolution, it's about the responsiveness of the technology that makes us believe we're in something when we're actually not. And so I started to do a thought exercise that said, could we build a matrix? How long would it take us to get there, and what are the stages to get to what I call the simulation point? And that's the point at which we would be capable of producing a video game that is so indistinguishable from reality that the players would not know that they were inside a video game. And if we could get there, that raises a bigger question, which is about the simulation hypothesis, which is, has someone already gotten there?
Too much watching The Matrix or groundbreaking theory? I'll let you ponder on that one for a minute, because that's kind of yanking the rug out from underneath what we think of as we know reality. Quantum mechanics goes a little beyond the obvious and into the building blocks of what everything in the universe is made out of. When you take an image and break it down apart into its pixels, it would be awfully hard to tell what the image was anymore. But we rarely think of our coffee cup that way. We can take the pixels from your computer and print you another coffee mug. So where's the line between pixels and a real coffee mug when it started with bits of information? It makes it all a pretty interesting hypothesis for sure. It's appropriate that we're discussing this in a virtual space, because that's where the theorist above actually started down the path: gamification. It's entirely possible that we're just in someone else's video game. Per his story about table tennis, you can start to imagine what a racing simulator is doing to trick your brain into immersing itself into your game. If you've ever experienced how thrilling it can be, or seen meme videos of racers sending their simulator rig crashing to the living room floor from a virtual wreck, then perhaps you see the power such computer pixels have over a consciousness. But what is reality? So many people think that they can know what that is and proceed to contradict some of the most widely accepted consensus facts in existence, like what shape the Earth is. We can know by neuroscience that everything we experience is closer to a hallucination than actual reality. That's right, I said you're basically hallucinating right now, while watching this video, listening to the podcast, or reading it in article form. Everything you do. We're not just tripping out here on a magic carpet ride, but rather having the experience of the human perception. There's nothing that doesn't get filtered through our perception, and it's how we reconstruct life inside our heads. We're dependent on a system that translates stimulus from our other senses, and it relies on the filing cabinet of information we've collected over the years from living to do it. If you needed a source on this, it'll be down below, because I'm sure there might have been a few who scoffed at that notion. This has much to do with how I can be playing a computer game right now, but it's simultaneously training me how to be a more effective driver in a real car too, because my perception can be tricked into believing in alternative realities where my body doesn't know the difference between the two situations. It's translating information using similar enough stimulus to shape the same set of skills. Not every region of your brain recognizes that you're in a computer game, even if you think you consciously know. So consider what your brain does with the information. There's a part of your brain that doesn't even recognize the difference between you and someone else. So despite your conscious idea that you're just you, and that's another person, there's actually a section of your brain that missed the memo. Consider how your brain is coordinating through billions of neurons, but it's maybe not coordinating in the way you assume. It's the reason why you feel on behalf of others in an instant. The cringe you get if you see someone get injured in a serious accident is information from a part of your brain that momentarily thought that was you in the accident. There's plenty of research and arguments about mirror neurons at this point due to how difficult it is to experiment with on humans, which would raise some ethics issues. However, in 2010, there was the first direct recording of mirror neurons in the human brain despite the arguments that had been previously raised about their existence. That will be in the description, by the way. They still argue how much these neurons play a role in cognition or social understanding, but the developing hypothesis states that these neurons may be the source of empathy. There are reasons why so many can live in a worldview so distant from realities widely shared. If we're all dependent upon our hallucination, then grasp on reality is pretty easy to lose, especially when events happen that are difficult to accept and our brains give us the option of denial or fact. Those who drift into denial find themselves floating further out to an island all their own, where the world works in a way that their mind expects, but that they would struggle to scream for anyone to echo their theories in validation. The world between virtual and real world is starting to look a little fuzzy, and in this segment, blurring the lines between landscapes by diving into people science and the proposed life simulator on social levels, micro to massive. At the center of the tech innovation, and located next to two iconic racetracks in Silicon Valley, I've been getting a heckin' education in so many schools. Hard Knocks in no small way being one of them. My take might be sliding into the cynical joking format of the HBO series because, well, if you live here, then perhaps you already know. But for those who don't...
You wanna know what I have? A fucking car whose doors open like this. Not like this, not like this. These are not the doors of a billionaire, Richard. Fuck you!
Doors that go like this? Isn't even an exaggeration on the type of exposure one might have to area residents. Oh my, do I have some stories to tell after working in the exotic car industry and motorsports around the area. I'm not sure if I would label them in the interesting category or just disturbing, perhaps humorous. There's a roller coaster of emotions to be had in the capital of venture capital. It does illustrate societal issues well for a place that proclaims to be progressive. I'm not even sure what that means anymore after hearing the span of semantic arguments, but it's conflated with ones found in the dictionary for certain. What is certain is that the once thought mutual goal isn't as agreed upon as a consensus as thought. When social constructs become a reality is a valid discussion topic. It might be one of the more fascinating examples of this potential life simulation hypothesis. What happens when you make the worst corporate policy decisions possible? We're finding that out now in a world overrun with information, some of which is highly suspect or just plain false, where more Americans fall for fake news than don't. Despite their educations, emotions still make people immune to reality they don't want to see, because we run on hallucination, and that makes it possible to die what's even the most obvious of truth. Anyone familiar with confirmation bias already? If you haven't, it looks like someone walking by a homeless person grumbling that they'll just spend their money on drugs and alcohol if they're given anything. It's really believing such a story could be explained on site. It's being sure that one car brand is better than another, or that one fast food restaurant chain is any worse than the next. There's no real good reason to stop smoking if confirmation bias works so well. Right? There's being sure that you have any power over people's feelings. All too often I hear people say, "So-and-so made me feel mad." Oh, how so? Because our brains don't actually work that way unless you're aware of some super secret microchip that allows that. We're not doing conspiracy theory trains here, that's curiosity for another day. But consider, what if someone insulted you in a language that you did not understand or speak? Would you feel anything if you didn't even know what was said? Perhaps it is that you would have to translate it through your perception? So little do people think about how reliant they are on their hallucination. It would take information of that language to decode that there was an insult even being flung, or even the knowledge to accept such an insult was correctly correlated to the individual whom it was hurled at. Perhaps it can spark any emotion at all, perhaps not. Yet trolls are so insistent that their time is well spent generating negative feelings in the minds of others. Have they considered that they have so little control over the hallucination of another? Or is it only their hallucination they see? In their minds, they can conjure a scenario where they've won, even if their works had no impact. Encompassingly shows what cognitive bias over core beliefs looks like, and this life simulation is full of them. You've probably run into a few of them on social media lately. The word bias is out there a lot, but it's such a huge concept for such an itty-bitty four-letter word. It's got a dirty connotation, but we're still going there because it leads to fascinating patterns of how decisions get made, even some that change the way we live for the good and bad. Let's get a little more comfortable with that four-letter word bias and find out how it's tweaking everyone's individual life simulation programming based on which ones they have. And they might not even know it yet, which is okay. Don't freak out, it's fine, they happen to people. What's important is just reworking them. Bias typically gets confined to referencing humans, but hold up for a moment because you can have a bias about refrigerators and televisions too. This might illustrate better why bias is a problem even if you don't care about people's feelings, but you probably do. Biases towards products can dictate good or bad buying decisions. As bias is intricately interlaced in judgment, it will define the life a person lives or how they see it. This segment and its future episodes are about decoding the core beliefs humans develop and how they affect people in their day-to-day lives. What are thoughts, logics, and histories behind some of our biggest cognitive bias slip-ups? We'll get into how the brain works and what neuroscience is learning about us and how to apply science to your thinking as we walk through a little bit of life simulating while goofing around on racing simulators. Don't just train for speed. Train for clarity and emotional strength through reshaping perspective hallucination. Let's do some life simulating about social situations, science, and the society we live in. Gonna be playing some sim games, including The Sims, and see how much time spent in simulated worlds boomerangs back to reshaping reality in a modern technological world. Even social media is suspect for simulation given algorithms and how much internet traffic is faked by automation. That's another topic, so if that's interesting, stick around. We should all consider what we think we know, because it could just be our own perception playing tricks on us. I believe it was Ice Cube who gave the sage advice, better check yourself before you wreck yourself. And that's true, because we're often our own worst enemy. Being a better ally starts from thoughts. Cognitive processing can be accelerated through removing that enemy from its ranks, and the result may astound you. It's not easy, but you have it in you. You're a tough critic, but bet you can impress yourself. You got this!
What is real? How do you define real? If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.